We are today with Joseph Humire, analyst at the Center for a Secure Free Society. He just released a report for the Atlantic Council, the Maduro-HEZBOLLAH Nexus, how Iran-backed networks prop up the Venezuelan regime. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Maria. It's always a pleasure. I'm glad to be on your show.
I mean, your paper is really interesting because Iran and Hezbollah, they are the new topics for Latin America. Yesterday, the United States put other sanctions against Iran, and Venezuela is the perfect country for this evil alliance. Let's start talking about the Hezbollah External Security Organization, the Unit 910, how radicated it is in Venezuela, and who are the main players in Venezuela allowing Hezbollah to grow and to flourish?
Yeah. So, the Unit 910, which you mentioned, otherwise known as the External Security Organization, or they also go by the name of the Islamic Jihad Organization. It's basically the extraterritorial clandestine arm of Hezbollah. They function like an intelligence organization, right? They engage in espionage, they use tradecraft, they develop assets, and so they're operating worldwide. And they've been in Latin America since the beginning. I think since the beginning of the birth of Hezbollah in the 1980s, they dispatched these assets over to South America, and they've been operating since then. What I did in the report is I drew a direct line from the terrorist attack that's most notably well known in South America with Hezbollah, which is the AMI attack in Argentina, and a little known fact of that attack, which is that there was a Venezuelan Lebanese individual that was suspected of being involved in that operation. His name is Amir Mohammed Akil Rada. And so what I drew is a line that basically describes that he after the attack, he basically went to hide out in Venezuela, and he's been in Venezuela pretty much ever since. And so he's part of a bigger network. He's part of a bigger, what we call in the report, clan or Lebanese family in Venezuela. That's the Rada clan. And they're still active today. They're working very closely on different legitimate businesses. But I think the trick of Hezbollah is they mix the legitimate with the illicit. So they're working with legitimate businesses, but also with illicit enterprise. And obviously in Venezuela, a lot of this is with or under the control of the Maduro regime. And so that's one actor. But I'd say to your question about who's the main actors, in the case of Venezuela, it's really two. It's Tarek El-Aissami, who's the current Minister of Petroleum, but he's held all kinds of positions. He is more recently the Vice President. He was also the Minister of Industry. He was a governor, and he was the Minister of Interior. So since 2008, he's held a series of positions in high-ranking positions in the Chavez, now Maduro regime. And he's Syrian Lebanese descent. So he has the ethnic and the cultural understanding of the Middle East, and he used that understanding to make this network. I would say pretty much his partner in all this is a gentleman named Ghazi Nasruddin. And there's a bit of a focus in the report on Ghazi Nasruddin. He's probably the most well-known among these individuals and clans because he's not only been sanctioned and he's been listed by the FBI, but he also had a public position. He wasn't just a supporter of the Maduro or the Chavez and Maduro regime. He was part of it. He was a diplomat. He was given. He was part of the foreign ministry. He was sent to Syria, and he operated in the Venezuelan embassy in Damascus. Now he was pretty much the fixer that allowed Hezbollah to connect to Maduro. And back in this case, Chavez and Maduro. But Maduro was the foreign minister back then, so he was very much involved in all of this. But it allowed Hezbollah to connect to the Venezuelan regime, but through clandestine channels, so that Hezbollah could always say, we don't do anything illegally with Venezuela, and Chavez and the Maduro would say, we just have political solidarity with Hezbollah. So they would manipulate the message, but the reality was Ghazi Nasruddin was building that network, which is mostly an illicit network. It had to do with drug trafficking, weapon smuggling, money laundering. Yeah. So I mean, in the report I mentioned an indictment that was unsealed in May of this year. It's against the former Venezuelan assemblyman, which his name is Adel Zabayer. And if you read that indictment, it's very lengthy. And if you read the indictment, there is essentially an allegation of a meeting in 2009 where Tarek El-Aissami went to Syria, met with Ghazi Nasruddin and supposedly high-ranking Hezbollah operatives to talk about a weapon for a cocaine scheme. So essentially it was cocaine coming from the FARC in Colombia to Hezbollah in the Middle East, and weapons coming back into the hands of the FARC. the Venezuelan government served as the broker of that deal, according to this indictment. Now, again, as I mentioned before, these are allegations, right? Obviously, we would all like to see these convictions and see this through trial, but Hezbollah doesn't tend to present themselves before the court. So I think what we can base on is the patterns and trends that we're seeing of how this fits. And so, while I can't personally say I know that meeting took place, what I can say is it fits within a pattern and trend of what we've seen with both with Hezbollah and with the Maduro regime.
We have always seen Colombia and Venezuela as osmotic countries for political reasons, for cocaine smuggling. Do you think that in this moment Venezuela is essential for FARC, but also ELN, the other revolutionary movements that are moving in a certain way to Venezuela?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that we did in the paper, or what I did in the paper, was I try to give it a theoretical and analytical construct, right? To not just dive right into the clans and the families, but to explain this from an academic perspective. And so there's a theory, so if you will, that's used to understand organized crime and terrorism these days. And it's been elaborated mostly by the National Defense University here in Washington. And it's called convergence theory, threat convergence theory. And what threat convergence theory is essentially the conjoining of international terrorism and transnational organized crime, something that many analysts in the early part of the 21st century said that doesn't really going to happen because terrorists have political objectives, criminals have profit objectives, so they're not really going to see the same thing or have the same goals. And while that's partly correct, I don't think terrorists are just abandoning their political causes, or criminals are just forgetting about what their main goal is, which is profits, illicit profits. What you are seeing is that the nexus is logistical. So the logistical operatives, like the accountants, the technicians, the transportation, all the logistical networks have brought these two phenomenons closer together, the convergence of crime and terror. And countries like Venezuela, where the regimes have used these criminal and terrorist networks as part of its foreign policy, as part of its ability to extend its power throughout their country, throughout the regions. What that's done is they provided a safe space so that this convergence happens. So to your question, I think Venezuela has become what I call a global hub for the convergence of organized crime and terror. So if you're a criminal or if you're a terrorist and you're wanted by any country in the world, you have an arrest warrant, an indictment, you get to Venezuela, you're safe. You're not going to be extradited, you're not going to be arrested. And I think that Venezuela provides that safe space for all these. I mean, and even the main ones that you mentioned, the Colombian ones, FARC, ELN, the big ones like Hezbollah, but all these little criminal syndicates that no one really had heard of, and they all kind of come out into Venezuela. So I think Venezuela has that. And I can, let me just, one last point. I think it has a lot to do with also the perspective that the Venezuelan regime and the Iranian regime has on organized crime. Like, they don't see that as necessarily a bad thing. They see that as an asymmetric weapon to basically attack their adversaries by weakening their institutions and infiltrating their societies. So if you're, the Venezuelan regime, you're like, this is my best tool, this is my best weapon I have to establish, go after my objectives.
In your paper, you mentioned different places, Isla Margarita, and then Panama, but Colombia, we already talked about it. It's very interesting because even in the past, Isla Margarita was a hub for international crime, international terrorism. There were speculations that even Osama bin Laden went there. In your opinion, what did change in Isla Margarita now? What's new now in Isla Margarita in relationship with Panama too?
Well, I think most of these places, if you pay close attention to how the locations that we identify in the report, they're along the Caribbean coast, right? They're all along the coast between Colombia and Venezuela, and they're near ports. They're near port cities. And so I think that's kind of falls within the larger pattern of what Hezbollah does, right? They operate near ports, they operate near coastal lines because they're heavily involved in commerce. 14% of Lebanon's GDP is remittances. So they tap into the Lebanese communities worldwide, the commercial connections that they have with the home country in Lebanon. They infiltrate that, they co-opt some of these businesses, and they bring that more to the illicit side. Basically, they'll bully a Lebanese businessman to say, hey, you have a commercial textile company? Well, we need that to launder our money. And sometimes the individual or the company will say no, but oftentimes they'll say yes because, unless somebody stops Hezbollah, they operate like that mafia. And so what you see in the report is you see that that's where they're strategically located, near the ports, near free trade zones, near these commercial enterprises. And Margarita Island, more before it was like an illicit hub, it was really a commercial hub. It was a lot of tourism, a lot of trade, a lot of commerce, and this specific clan that I mentioned in the paper, the Nasruddin clan, they basically co-opted this entire island and brought it more into Hezbollah's control. And what my argument in the paper is that I think Margarita Islands become kind of like a safe haven in the sense of all the illicit networks that they can put. They can tie that into the industries that are most prominent in the island. There's not mentioned in the report, but there's another case of a person that's suspected of being involved, or at least knows about another terrorist attack in Panama, the one with the Al-Ashar Khan's flight that was...
One day after a me attack, if I'm not
exactly,
wrong.
Yeah, it was on July 19th, 1994,
yeah,
the day after.
Coincidence.
25 people died in that attack, including members of the Jewish community, Panama. And one of the individuals that's suspected of being involved in that, he has a business, a restaurant, a bar in Margarita Island. And he was just recently mentioned by the FBI because the FBI said, we're looking for this individual. If anyone has information. Well, everyone in Venezuela is like, we know who he is because he operates one of the best bars in Margarita Island. So this is just a small example, but to show how Venezuela has become kind of this hub. So the big point is free trade zones, ports, coastal lines. And I think that's a pattern that we've seen, not just in Latin America. We've seen that in Africa. We've seen that obviously in the Middle East and Beirut, but we've seen it globally with Hezbollah.
You talk about Salman Rauf Salman, and he seems to be the chief of operations of Hezbollah operations in Latin America. Do you know something about his whereabouts? What can we say about him?
Well, I mean, he's suspected to be in Lebanon, right? And he's supposed to be in the southern suburbs of Beirut in Lebanon. I don't know exactly where he is, but I would say that he's an individual that's been under the radar of many law enforcement intelligence authorities worldwide and in Latin America because he was involved in the Ami attack. He was one of the guys that was most prominently named, not just by Nisman. Nisman obviously mentioned him as well, but he was also mentioned by the intelligence services that did the initial, not the initial investigation in '94, but the initial investigations in 2002 that led to Nisman's indictments in 2006. And he's like pretty much the Hezbollah coordinator for the entire attack. He worked with Iran very closely, and he worked with local cutouts inside Colombia, Brazil, Paraguay, and Argentina. And so he's an individual that's been like a ghost. He's been very hard to track and trace, and he moves around. And what I think has been interesting about Salman Rauf Salman is that he's essentially become kind of like a handler for all these little Hezbollah assets and agents that are popping up around the world, not just in Latin America. I'm talking also in Europe, in Southeast Asia. So he's been named in multiple terror plots worldwide. And I would put this in the context of, I think Hezbollah since 2008 has kind of had an inflection point. They realized, one of their top leaders died in 2008, Ahmad Magnia, and they basically decided to increase their operational tempo worldwide to seek vengeance for his death. But then that was complemented by Iran, when Iran realized, well, if Hezbollah is going to be more active, then we want to help that, because they also wanted to put pressure mechanisms in place after 2012 to be able to get the nuclear deal done. It's kind of the way Iran negotiates, right, through pressure. And so in that, Hezbollah started a massive recruitment effort, but not recruitment for like terrorists, but recruitment for spies, or recruitment for assets, and in that, some of these people got caught. There's a case in Peru, for example, a guy named Mohammed Ghalib Hamdar, who was caught by the Peruvian authorities in 2013. I'm sorry, in 2014.
14.
Yeah, he was arrested in 2014. And
not for terrorism, because Peru didn't recognize terrorism at that time.
Well, he actually was charged with conspiracy to commit an act of terrorism.
Yeah, at the end,
but
not at the beginning.
He was also charged with immigration fraud.
Exactly.
And then he got convicted of immigration fraud in 2016 and absolved of the terrorism charges. But the Supreme Court annulled that decision in Peru and retried the case on the terrorism charge. So they're still waiting for the final decision in Peru. But the very important point of that case in Hamdar, and I know a little bit about it because I was invited to be an expert witness to the trial. So I came down, I looked at the documents. Salman Rauf Salman was his handler. That was the person that was controlling that operation. And it didn't just involve Hamdar, it involved other Hezbollah operatives in Bolivia, operatives in Chile, and in the neighborhood. And that's a trend we're seeing. Like, his name is being mentioned more and more. And I think it's, he's a person that has a leadership role in that Unit 910 of Hezbollah, and has basically perfected the dark arts of tradecraft to be able to create a spy network for Hezbollah worldwide.
Let's talk about Oli, which is the new challenge for the relationship between Venezuela and Iran. You mentioned in your paper Alex Saab, who is now in prison in Cape Verde. And first of all, what do you think about the future of Alex Saab? In my opinion, it will be very hard will be him extradited to United States first. And second, who is filling this void? Because Alex Saab was a facilitator in a certain way between Venezuela and Iran. Alex Saab is Colombian, Lebanese Colombian guy. So what do you think about him, and who is replacing him?
Yeah, just quickly, so is Salman Salman is Lebanese Colombian as well. So the Colombian connection is very strong for Hezbollah. But to your question about Alex Saab, Alex Saab is an individual that I think before 2018, no one really even knew who he was on the global scale. People in Barranquilla, Colombia knew who he was because he was a very prominent businessman. But his business wasn't always legitimate. His business was in narco trafficking. He partnered with drug cartels in Mexico and in Colombia and other places. So he built a trade-based money laundering. He didn't build it, but he worked within a bigger trade-based money laundering network that was connected to the Venezuelan regime. And so when Venezuela figures out that Alex Saab has all these connections, has all these networks, and has financial conduits and pathways that can be beneficial, they tap him to be basically their special representative with Iran, to work out all these deals with gold and gas for what's happening right now in Venezuela. And his arrest and detention in Cape Verde, I think, was a very positive sign that we can dismantle some of these networks. Unfortunately, I don't think the extradition is taking place yet. I'm not throwing in the towel to think that won't happen. I still maintain some optimism that could happen, although I do admit it's taking a lot longer than what anyone would have anticipated. So in the absence of Alex Saab, right, Maduro can go back into the network. They go back into the network and say, who else do we have here that can do some of the things that Alex Saab was doing? So what did Alex Saab bring to the table? Well, he brought Middle East connections, an understanding, relationships, and an understanding of the culture and the language of a place that's very different than Latin America, right? Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Iran. And he also brought business credentials that they can be used to legitimize activities that are like humanitarian assistance, but based on illicit activity networks that are already planting those connections. So who's a person that fits that criteria? Well, there's two brothers in Venezuela called the Khalil Mazu brothers, and they've been known to authorities. They've been like their names came up in the Narco Sobrinos case in 2014 in Venezuela, in 2015 in Venezuela, and in the U.S. that was a case that went arrested the nephews of Celia Flores, the wife of Nicolas Maduro, and has now convicted them and sentenced them to prison in New York. Their names were brought up in those cases. They were brought up in other instances. They were brought up by an investigation in Bolivia that was done by a senator now who's the minister of government, who talked about one of the brothers basically doing preferential business deals with Evo Morales on oil and gas. They were brought up in investigations in Canada. So they were mentioned in an investigation in Iraq. So their name kind of was popping up a lot. And what I put in the report is I think that they have the capabilities to provide the same services that Alex Saab was providing to the Maduro regime to make those connections with the Middle East much more solid. And I would say that we have access to his immigration records, and he has been traveling to Turkey repeatedly over the course of the last few years, including in February of this year.
Are they linked to the Mega C supermarket, or they have nothing to see?
I haven't seen that connection. It's possible. It doesn't mean that I haven't looked that closely too. But the Megasis, the Iranian supermarket in Caracas in Venezuela, is mostly run by an Iranian military network called the MADURO, the Ministry of Defense and Armed Forces Logistics. Now that's a network that's existed in Venezuela for 14 years. It's been there since 2006. The IRGC often works within this logistical industry of the military in Iran. So I wouldn't be surprised if they're involved in that. But what I've been looking mostly when it comes to the Khalil Mazu brothers is the oil, because I think that's an industry that they work in. They have a company that deals in the oil and gas industry. As I mentioned before, Khalil Masu, when he went to Bolivia, the deals that he signed with the Evo Morales government had to do with oil and gas, with the Bolivian state-owned enterprise. So I've been looking more on that level. That's not to say that, they also work, you're right, in food and nutrition. So it's possible that they could be suppliers for that new Iranian supermarket, but I can't confirm that.
Let's move to Bolivia, because actually when we travel to Latin America, we can find Iran and Hezbollah everywhere. In Bolivia, they still have a presence, an important presence. They inaugurated a school for a anti-imperialist commander from army it was in Varnes, near Santa Cruz. And in 2017, a Saudi newspaper mentioned the news that a bombing plot was discovered in La Paz, and 2.5 tons of, ammonium nitrate were discovered. It means that Iran is interested in Bolivia. It started with Morales. And what about the situation now? I mean, Bolivia is facing new elections next week. What's your analysis about it? Do you feel that Iran can infiltrate the elections, so they have no interest in?
On the elections, I'm not sure, but I think one of the untold stories and pretty much unknown aspects of Evo Morales' regime in Bolivia, the 14 years that he was pretty much in control of the country, is Iran's cooperation with him. And now there's some overt aspects of the cooperation, like the deals that were signed. They signed a big deal in 2007, and then basically a strategic framework, and then had many deals signed since then. Now, critics will say, well, those deals were just on paper. They didn't really materialize a lot of this. They might have started a health clinic, maybe a milk processing plant, and some other small things, but where's the major trade? Well, I think when we look at Iran, we understand that they don't really use trade as a traditional mechanism for relationships. They use trade as a cover mechanism to insert operatives, spies, and others. And so there was an uptick during Evo Morales' regime of the Iranian embassy in La Paz. Like the embassy itself got more operatives, got more people coming in under the guise of cultural attaches or commercial attaches. And so we started to see that they started to set up the culture centers. And this is a little bit different than like Argentina, Brazil, and Venezuela, where in the past there was almost zero presence of Iran and Bolivia before Evo Morales. In these other countries before Hugo Chavez, there was an Iranian embassy in Venezuela. Obviously, in the AMIA, there was already activity in Argentina. Brazil, obviously, yes, historic. But there wasn't much of activity in Bolivia until Evo Morales came in. And then they basically went from 0 to 100 in literally about 4 years. From 2007 to 2012, they basically established so many networks in the country, and they operated in a very covert fashion. Let me give you an example. One of the things that beyond the schools and all that stuff, one of the things that was done was in a television network. Iran has Hispan TV, which is their Spanish language 24-hour broadcast in 16 countries in Latin America. But beyond that, they created a local network inside Bolivia called Abya Yala TV. And Abya Yala TV is ostensibly a Bolivian TV channel. That Abya Yala means land of the indigenous people. So it really targeted a message to the indigenous communities in Bolivia. And what that network did was serve as a cover platform for the movement of Iranian operatives. You had cameramen, photographers, videographers coming in.
Coming from Iran.
All coming from Iran under the guise of we're working within this TV network, we're working on a documentary, we're working on a special, and what you saw is they had preferential access to the Bolivian government under Evo Morales. They had close access to ministers, close access to government officials, and so this network served to me as a cover platform. And there's more to be said about that, but in the upshot of all of it is that Iran was able to hide themselves and be invisible in Bolivia because they layered themselves within the Bolivian government, much like the same in Venezuela. In Venezuela, we didn't see Iran very well because they were layered within different entities of the Venezuelan government. Well, that same thing happened in Bolivia. And I think when you start to map some of this, and unfortunately, I don't have all that information right now for you. We have it, we're analyzing it, and we haven't reported on it because we're still confirming a lot of this. But I could say that the connection lies within the petrochemical industry. And so if you tie into what Iran has done in Venezuela with the petrochemical industry and extend that to what they've been done in Bolivia with the petrochemical industry, you find the connections. And those connections seem to be more significant than what we would initially think.
You also have lithium, which is very important for them, or not? Don't you think?
Yeah, they tried to get access to the lithium markets, but really they didn't have much success. Basically, China pretty much got most of that, and then even Germany was able to tap into that. So Iran's access to the strategic minerals in Bolivia, I think were a mixed success. They had some success, but they weren't able to get into that. A lot of that what was done as basically creating a corridor to be able to take minerals from Brazil, actually. And so they had more success at getting the minerals in Brazil, mostly because the Bolivian mining industry isn't dedicated to a lot of the minerals that Iran would be interested in. Lithium, gold, and silver, which are the historic industries in Bolivia, are something that Iran could be interested in for sure. But what they were after were dual-use minerals, minerals that can actually have a much more specific application to the weapons programs, like thorium, like tantalum, and the major deposits for those minerals were on the other side of the border in Brazil. So they would do that activity in Brazil, but they needed Bolivia to export it. They needed Bolivia to push it out. So they developed the corridors to do so. There was a case, actually, I can't remember what year, I think it was in 2012, 13, where they found a bag full of minerals, essentially, in the basement of the Venezuelan Defense Attaché's office in La Paz. And the media in Bolivia mistakenly reported that initially as uranium. It wasn't uranium. What it was tantalite. It was tantalite being moved through garbage bags through the Venezuelan Defense Attaché and was being pushed out through a port in northern Chile of Arica. And so the police in Bolivia arrested that, but then they quickly covered it up. So they didn't report much on it, but we were able to access some of the documents on that, and that was an Iranian network that showed that.
Just to finalize our interview, we have 6 candidates in Bolivia. We can say that the most important are Carlos Mesas, Tuto Quiroga, and Luis Arce, as you say in Spanish. What do you think? Do you think that the Evo Morales party, MAS, could win? And what kind of scenarios you can see for Bolivia?
Yeah, so I think the name of the party is really important. It's called the Movement Towards Socialism. So it gives you a hint at what they're trying to do. Because I remember back when Evo Morales was elected in 2005, everyone's like, oh, we don't know what he's going to do. We don't know how he's going to be. I was like, his political party called Movement Towards Socialism. So it tells you where they're going to go. And I think that he's had some success. And that people argue that his economic policies weren't all socialist. And this is true. But they weren't like nationalizations, like Hugo Chavez did in Venezuela. But they were very much involved with a high degree of social spending. They spent so much money under the Evo Morales government, and they depleted their foreign reserves. They grew the foreign reserves, but then they used all that money to the point that Bolivia is heading into an economic crisis. And with COVID, pretty much all of Latin America is heading into an economic crisis. So whoever's the next president of Bolivia is going to face a very, very difficult time. Bolivia is a poorer country than most in South America, so it's going to be very turbulent, I think, in the coming years. Now, when you question the election, I'm concerned in the sense that, whatever gains were made last year with the civil society movements that were able to pressure Bolivia to make sure that Evo Morales didn't get away with fraud and didn't engage in some kind of, basically, he already violated the Constitution anyway by trying to run for a 4th term and force him to resign. The gains or the positive aspect of that can be lost because the opposition political elements can't seem to get together. They can't seem to unite. They seem to be fighting all over the place. And so there shouldn't be, but unfortunately I think there is a scenario where the Luis Arce, the candidate for the MAS, can win in the first round. That's if these other candidates don't coalesce around one candidate. So if the anti-MAS vote, which is the bigger vote in Bolivia, the people that I'd say is about 70% of people in Bolivia don't want MAS to come back. About 30% is the base of the MAS. But if that 70% is divided into 5 people, then you might get a situation when the MAS comes back, even with just 30% of support in the country. We'll see how it happens. But I think I want to point to one other thing. I think is October 18th is a very significant date, right? So it's not just the date of the Bolivian election, but it's also the date of the so-called lifting of the arms embargo of Iran. And so after October 18th, we could have a different security landscape in South America where you could have an emboldened Iran thinking that they, don't have an arms embargo. I'm going to send armaments to Venezuela. And then you have the MAS potentially returning in Bolivia. They say, you know what? Well, we're going to also send armaments to Bolivia. And you could have Iran much more active, at least visibly, in South America than what we've seen before. So the Bolivia-Venezuela connection is very important. I think the Evo Morales connection to Maduro was very strategic. And in Iran's connection to all of them, it complicates things and makes it much more dangerous for democracies and stability in the Western Hemisphere.
Let's see what's going to happen. And really thank you for your contribution. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Maria. It's a pleasure.